If you have filled up your gas tank recently, you already know something is different. Gas prices in parts of Canada are sitting above $1.72 a litre. Some cities are higher and the price have been climbing for weeks. The reason is a war. 5 weeks ago, the United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran. Iran responded by doing something that changed the economics of energy for the entire planet. It effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Today, we are going to answer 3 questions. What is the Strait of Hormuz and why does it matter so much? And what is the Bank of Canada doing about the inflation that's following from it? And what should Canada be doing, if anything, to give drivers some relief? The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at the southern end of the Persian Gulf. At its narrowest point, it's roughly 35 kilometers wide. And through that corridor, about 20% of the world's entire traded oil supply normally flows through every single day. Iran controls the northern shore of its strait. Since the war began, Iran has threatened to attack virtually any vessel passing through. Hundreds of commercial ships have dropped anchors in the Persian Gulf to avoid the risk. Oil tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude every day have stopped moving through. The world has lost between 4.5 and 5 million barrels per day of oil supply due to the war, approximately 5% of the global supply. He has written that number could double by mid-April as inventories are drawing down and the shortage starts to bite. That supply loss is what's showing up at your gas pump. The Bank of Canada's January monetary policy report assumed oil would be around $60 a barrel for its forecast horizon. By mid-March, Brent crude was trading at approximately $110 per barrel, an increase of more than 80% in a matter of weeks. At one point during the conflict, it briefly touched $120. That oil price spike translates directly to Canadian consumers. According to Bloomberg, the average gas price in Canada surged from roughly $1.30 a litre in late February to $1.55 by mid-March, and it has continued rising. At $1.72 in Toronto, some Canadian cities are already seeing prices higher than that. British Columbia and Prince Edward Island have been among the most affected. Here's the important context. The federal consumer carbon tax was eliminated by the Carney government earlier this year. That had given Canadians some relief at the pump. According to Bloomberg, the Iran war has now wiped out that relief entirely and gone further. On March 18th, the Bank of Canada held its key interest rate at 2.25% for the third consecutive time. Governor Tiff McCallum was direct about the bind the central bank is in. Higher prices of oil push up inflation, which would normally call for a rate hike to cool things down. But Canadian economy was already showing before the war began, and raising rates in a weakening economy will risk tipping it into recession. But he said, we are operating in a world where there is more than one thing going on. He was careful to add, we can't fix the war. What we can do is ensure if energy prices stay high, it does not become ongoing, generalized, persistent inflation. In other words, the bank is watching and it is prepared to act, but it won't act until it knows whether the oil price shock is temporary or lasting. Understanding why the Bank of Canada didn't act more decisively requires understanding where the economy already was. In February, Canada lost 84,000 jobs, a significant reversal of the gains made in the late 2025. The unemployment rate rose 6.7%. GDP contracted by 0.6% in the fourth quarter of 2025, undershooting the bank's own forecast. Housing is weaker than projected. Exports are soft. This was the picture before the oil price shock from Iran began to filter through. The combination of a slowing economy and rising energy-driven inflation creates what economists call a stagflation risk. The painful scenario where you have both slow growth and rising prices simultaneously. It is a central banker's worst situation because the tools that fight inflation tend to make slow growth worse, and vice versa. Randall Bartlett, deputy chief economist at Desjardins, said before the bank's decision that the economy was weak but not one where it necessarily warranted the bank to move interest rates in either direction. The oil shock made that already difficult judgment even harder. Whether the oil price shock is temporary or lasting depends almost entirely on one question: how long does this war go on? And on that question, the signals this week are genuinely contradictory. President Trump announced on Truth Social that the US was in serious discussion with what he called a new and more reasonable regime to end the war. Pakistan has offered to host face-to-face talks. The diplomats of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt have been in conversation about possible negotiations. Iran says there are no negotiations taking place. The two sides have acknowledged exchanging messages through intermediaries, so there is some channel of communication. Supply chains take time to normalize. With gas prices at $1.72 a litre and rising, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is renewing calls for federal and provincial governments to suspend fuel taxes. Franco, the CTF's federal director, said the least governments could do is temporarily suspend fuel taxes and ideally makes those cuts permanent. It is a question being debated internationally. In the United States, lawmakers have introduced a legislation to suspend the federal gas tax. When asked about it, President Trump said he has thought about it but suggested states should act first. Several US states, including Connecticut, are already weighing gas tax holidays. In Europe, some countries responded to the 2022 energy crisis with temporary fuel tax reductions. The Canadian federal government has not announced any such measures. Whether it should is a question of trade-offs between immediate relief and a long-term fiscal and energy policy goals. There is a genuine complexity to Canada's position in this crisis that is worth understanding clearly. On one side of the ledger, Canada is a net exporter of oil and gas. When global prices rise, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador see higher royalty revenues. Energy companies earn more. The provinces that produce oil see their fiscal positions improve. Governor McCallum acknowledged this directly. Higher prices means more income coming into the country from energy exports. On the other side, Canadian consumers, whether they live in Alberta or Ontario, pay more at the pump and more to heat their homes. Businesses that use fuel see higher operating costs. Airline faces higher jet fuel prices. Trucking companies pass costs on. And because food distribution depends on transportation, grocery prices will follow. Randall Bartlett at Desjardins said higher energy prices would tilt the Bank of Canada away from needing rate cuts, which is good for inflation. But the broader economic costs could affect the revenue benefits. As one analyst puts it, Canada gets a boost in royalties with one hand and a headache at the grocery stores with the other. Here is something that has not received enough attention in the coverage of this story. The Strait of Hormuz does not only carry oil and gas. Petrochemical products, including fertilizers, also transit through it. Bank of Canada Governor McCallum flagged this explicitly at its March press conference. Fertilizer supply through the Strait of Hormuz is being disrupted. Canadian farmers are already feeling higher prices from the supply crunch. And because fertilizer is a primary input cost for growing food, higher fertilizer prices eventually mean higher food prices. Food inflation in Canada was already outpacing overall inflation for several months before the war began. McCallum noted the fertilizer disruption means consumers should not expect a meaningful relief at the grocery store anytime soon, even if the gas prices issues were resolved tomorrow. 5 things are worth tracking as this story develops. 1. The Strait of Hormuz. Oil industry analysts and executives have said that the strait needs to be reopened by mid-April or supply disruptions get significantly worse. Watch whether traffic resumes. That is the single most important variable. 2. The April 29th Bank of Canada decision. The bank will release its full monetary policy report that day, its most detailed economic outlook. How it characterizes the inflation risk from the oil shock will signal whether a rate hike later in 2026 is genuinely on the table. 3. Peace talks. Whether Iran and the US establish a genuine negotiating process, not just messages through intermediaries, will determine the duration of the oil disruption. 4. Grocery prices. The fertilizer disruption will show up in your food prices over the next 1 to 3 months. Watch Statistics Canada's CPI releases for food inflation specifically. 5. The gas tax question. If prices stay elevated, the political pressure on federal and provincial governments to provide relief will grow. Watch for announcements. All sources for this episode are in the description. This content is produced for information and entertainment purposes only. All facts are drawn from publicly available sources cited in the video description. Nothing in this episode constitutes financial, investment, or economic advice. Viewers are encouraged to verify information independently and form their own informed opinions. Canadian Politics Unplugged is not affiliated with any political party, government body, financial institutions, or special interest groups. Views expressed are those of the host only. Sources for this episode are in the description. Thanks for watching.